Every Memorial Day, services are held throughout America to remember those who have made the supreme sacrifice for all of us. The price in lives is enormous. Since 250 years ago, 1.3 million have given their lives for America. One way we honor them is to place a flag and perhaps flowers on veterans' graves. The placing of flowers began 3 years after the Civil War in New York. It spread across America, and May 30th was the chosen day to put flowers on veterans' graves, and it became known as Decoration Day. It remained that until 1971, and it was in that year that Congress changed the name to Memorial Day and put it on the last Monday in May. Our fallen heroes are the best of our national treasures, treasures more valuable than our national monuments, which would include even the U.S. Capitol and the White House. Many of those heroes are buried in our national cemeteries. I thought today I'd present some history about these cemeteries in the U.S. as well as overseas military cemeteries made. During the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, bodies were buried pretty much near the battle site in either local churchyards or unmarked mass graves, or maybe family cemeteries. The history of national cemeteries begins with the Civil War. At the beginning of that war, the U.S. was not prepared for the burial of more than 600,000 more dead in those 4 years, and that would include those that died in the Confederate cause. Given that many battles were on farm fields, soldiers usually received hasty burials in shallow graves, probably not more than 3 foot deep, where they fell. Commanding officers were required to keep records of deceased soldiers and their burial site locations. But oftentimes, commanding officers may have been wounded or killed themselves, so many times locations and names were not even known after a Civil War battle. It became very difficult because soldiers didn't carry identification, at least no identification that was issued. Dog tags didn't become issued until World War I. So some soldiers pinned on a piece of paper, they wrote their name and put it inside their jacket so that they could be identified, perhaps let their family know what happened to them. If you came from a wealthy family, perhaps your body could be shipped home by train. That didn't happen very often. Most of those volunteers were not from wealthy families. In fact, if you were from a wealthy family in the north, you could even buy your way out for $300. You could have a replacement served at your place. After Bull Run, the first battle of the Civil War, some 25 miles from Washington, D.C., it was decided to rebury the 460 Union soldiers at Arlington, Virginia, and thus began our first national cemetery. This site was selected because, well, one, it was close to Washington, D.C., and also it was the home of General Robert E. Lee. Lee, as you may or may not know, was offered the command of the Union Army, but turned it down in favor of going with his home state of Virginia when it seceded from the Union. So after Bull Run, those bodies of Union soldiers were taken for 25 miles or so to Arlington and were buried in the backyard of Robert E. Lee's home. This home was actually belonged to his wife, who was the granddaughter of Martha Washington. And they buried those soldiers right up to almost to the house. In fact, it was right up to Mrs. Lee's flower garden This was purposeful. They wanted to make sure that Lee, regardless of the outcome of the Civil War, that he never could return and live in that home, which actually worked. Lee actually, after the war, was compensated some for the home. There are about 27 to 30 burials every day in Arlington now. More than 400,000 are buried there on 639 acres. It grows each year, and they have room to expand when necessary. Arlington is also the home of the unknown soldier. There are 3 unidentified bodies in that tomb, one from World War I, one from World War II, and one from Korea. The second best known cemetery of the 34 that were created during the Civil War just is Gettysburg. Everybody's heard of Gettysburg. Just months after that battle, the cemetery's dedication was held to honor the 3,500 Union soldiers that died in that war's bloodiest war or battle. The cemetery today is best known because Lincoln gave an address called the Gettysburg Address. The main speaker that day was a prominent politician, president of Harvard University, and he was a well-known orator, a speaker. So he got up first, and he spoke for 2 hours. If you speak for 2 hours, that's roughly 13,000 words. People were standing listening to that. Apparently they were used to standing and listening to somebody talk. Then it was Lincoln's turn. He was invited to give appropriate remarks. So he stood and he gave a 272-word address that lasted just a shade over 2 minutes. The photographer that day was just getting his camera set up and didn't have a chance to take a picture of him given that famous address. Today there are 170 national cemeteries in the United States, including Fort McPherson near Maxwell, Nebraska, out west, and there's a brand new one in Omaha. Both offer burial spaces for eligible veterans and their spouses. Eligibility is open to all veterans who were discharged under conditions other than dishonorable. Fort McPherson, has anybody been there? Raise your hand. A couple hand up. It's a typical national cemetery with white stone crosses, done in a geometric fashion. And Carol and I were able to visit that cemetery. We were on what was called a tram tour or car ride across Nebraska. We did that for a number of years, all of them organized by Dwayne Tappy. And so one of the trips, we were scheduled to stop at that cemetery. Now, we had about 75 or more people in our group from all across the state, and we were in our own private cars, and there were about 30 or 35 of us all in a line, and we drove into Fort McPherson. The superintendent of the cemetery, well, he was a little surprised. He came out of the office, and he thought there was a funeral, and he forgot about it. When he saw all those cars lined up driving in, I can imagine the panic he must have felt. The wind smoothed it out quickly, and he felt a lot of relief, I'm sure. In addition to the national cemeteries, the United States also maintains 24 military cemeteries located in 16 countries, plus there are 25 memorial sites, the most known of which is the USS Arizona Memorial in Pearl Harbor. As you probably may know, survivors of that ship have the honor, if they wish, to have their bodies cremated and Navy frogmen upon their demise. And they also could, or their families could receive a piece of the substructure of the Arizona. Of the 24 overseas American military cemeteries, Carol and I had the privilege of visiting 2 of them. This was 9 years ago. The first one we visited, well, we visited Omaha Beach, I'll tell you, and one in the Netherlands. Omaha Beach is amazing, obviously, for the story of D-Day and that particular beach. Not too far away in the Netherlands is a cemetery at Margraten. It's at this cemetery that Carol's uncle is buried. Carol never met her uncle. Her uncle was 19 when he died in liberation of the Netherlands, which had been under Nazi rule for almost 5 years. To say that the Dutch people were appreciative of what the Americans did to liberate their country is an understatement. They so appreciated the sacrifice of these over 14,000 Americans who died doing that. Today, there are about 8,300 graves with stone markers, and another 1,700 that are inscribed on a wall for those where bodies were never found. They were buried, and the families were given 2 years to decide if they wanted their loved one shipped home or to remain in that cemetery. Carol's grandparents decided that their son should remain in that cemetery with those that he served, his brethren. Again, the people loved it so much that the year after the war ended, they created an adoption program where families could adopt a grave. In doing so, by adoption, they would visit the grave and they would put flowers there, probably some tulips, I'm guessing, or maybe plant a small American flag like you see out here. Within a year, all the graves have been adopted, and today there's a waiting list of 1,000 families that want to adopt a grave, and one of those graves becomes available. In fact, they quit taking names to put on the list right now. It's our responsibility as citizens to remember those who died in defense of our country, and also remember those that have worn the uniform and have since passed away. At this time, Gary, John, and I are going to read the names of those that are buried here, or in case of burial at sea, or in case of POWs who never returned. I will begin the roll call of the dead now. Civil War. Charles Fisher, C.A. Andrews, K.T. Rye, William Frazier, I.M. Belknap, Daniel Woodworth, Jacob Hikus, Charles Swanson, Samuel Bowers, Charles Phillips, Jacob Haas, Philip Fisk, Cyrus Hunger, Levi Kimball, Joshua Wills, Albert Chase, Levi Dilts, James Brown, Charles Oliver, E.E. Driscoll, William Thompson, Jacob Rhodes, Robert Sneed, Jacob Agler, John McKinney, Joseph Kimball, Henry Brewer, Otis Crane, Spanish-American War, George Mates, George Bartow, Henry Castler. World War I, Anton Bokamper, Oscar Mullenberg, Carl Benson, Max Matheson, Milton Henry, Lauren Patterson, John Martin, John Winstrad, James Leatherby, Henry Dixon, Harry Harrismith, Enoch Anderson, Ainer Erickson, Julius Peterson, Floyd Cluck, Harry Ward, Opie Sally, Albert Forsberg, Eric Frederickson, Earl Leonard, Lawrence Johnson, George Mitchell, Albert Shellington, Rudolph Hanson, Albert Board, W.L. Byers, Claude McConaughey, Harry Holmes, John Hanson, Gustav Hansen, Otto Nelson, Harold Donaldson, Rupert Moore, Clarence Larson, Nels Brooklyn, Paul Goldman, Carl Holmberg, Walter Johnson, C.D. Coe, Neil McCorkindale, C.C. Heights, George Grimm, Cornelius Haskell, Robert Hanson, David Dennison, Ora Cook, Arnold Lord, Waldemar Forsberg, Walter Scott, John Walter, Seth Anderson, Ernest Beatty, Walter Johnson, Byron Hayden, Clarence Heights, Charles Horton, Emil Peterson, Charles Ash, Edward Grubb, Walter Haglund, Neff Swigert, Max Hinsky, Jack Mitchell, Woody Guthrie, Ernst Edgar, Emil Ty, Alfred Meyer, George Eichhoff, Albert Snedell, Fred Harrison, Dick Sandoff, Alvin Frederickson, W.C. Bourne, Walter Chin, E.P. Quimby, Aaron Helgren, Cliff Busby, Walter Andrews, George Underhill, Ethan Casper, Harold Miner, Luck Heights. World War I and II, Otto Burke, Joseph Fleetwood. World War II, Albert Killian, Harold Russell, Joe Cordner, Forrest Peters, James Grahams, Dylan New, Norman Muller, Carl Burgesson, Lloyd Christensen, Reuben Nelson, Robert Olson, Orville Larson, Lawrence Collins, Everett Coleman, Ivan Halstrom, Rudy Weisswinger, Alan Laywinkle, Laverne Nelson, Carl Braun, Harold Holm, Fred Udick, Clarence Olson, Peter Vandermeer, Marlo Gustafson, Keith Kirkwood, Pat Murphy, Ira Carlson, Lawrence Barge, Norman Larson, Mildred Lundahl, Clarence Martinson, Gordon Bressler, Albert Johnson, James Wilkerson, Thurry Johnson, Orville Melton, Deloyd Meyer, John will continue.
William Moore, Isabel Nolte, Maurice Swanson, Francis Fisher, Delbert Nolte, Edwin Nelson, Harley Barr, Albert Anderson, Eldon Parliament, Fred Kellogg, George Bombard, Marvin Muller, James Davis, Bernard Levine, Eleanor Mathewson, William Days, Nolan Christensen, Donald Peters, Edwin Spade, Merlin Holmes, Ann Stark, Ronald Ellis, Lawrence Eckert, Lyle Richards, Donald Johnson, Leroy Lunds, Paul Gray, Myron Olson, Kermit Johnson, Bill Rouse, Alden Johnson, Gil Sharp, Gordon Forsberg, Floyd Johnson, Ian Backstrom, Lester Fisher, Mike Meyer, Kenneth Victor, Leroy Lundahl, Miriam Haglund, Carol Bingham, Bob Miner, Charles Carter, Emil Stallings, Bob Magus, Dale Anderson, Dan Gardner, Donald Lundahl, Bob Plow, Clarence Nelson, Warren Gessler, James Matheson, Donald Tell, Don Stitt, Daniel Gustafson, Harold Fisher, Kenneth Gustafson, Adolph Connell, Louis Hensky, Merlin Dressler, Max Coe, Sterling Ward, Brunel Gross, Marvin Bickle, Robert Ward, Darrell Jensen, Ian Pearson, Pierre Pearson, Eldon McGuire, Benton Nicholson, Dwayne Andrews, Dwayne Paul, Ephraim Johnson, Glenn Paulson, Wayne Sandall, Ray Prohaska, Gary Earlsheimer, there we go. Leonard Solomon, Alfred Benson, Curtis Turner, James Gustafson, Henry Meyer, Leland Herman, Everett Van Cleve, Evangeline Patterson, Albert Hammer, Harry Mills, Al Hitz, Walden Kramer, Leroy Swanson, Joe Mattis, Bud Looters, Alvin Sudell, Eugene London, Joe Claybaugh, Hubert Johnson, Pete Johnson, Paul Berman, Gordon Barnes, Cecil Rhodes, Raymond Paulson, Lillian Frederickson, Orville Furnow, Bob Busby, Cole Hagelin, Jack Donaldson, Bryce Nicholson, Elmer Carlson, Spud Erlinson, Eugene Swanson, Don Poles, Robert Hanson Jr., Cal Swaggerty, Norman Minola, Bill Harrison, Bob Burns, Brady C. Korean War, Cold War. Ed Custer, William Spenner, Alfred Udick, Ronald Bard, Carl Wallach, Gordon London, Earl Holm, Marla Cope, Elaine Foote, Clarence Weir, Richard Bach, Bud Ford, Gene Nelson, Norman Slama, Ted Rubicle, Harold Meyer, Norman Meyer, Ed Denverner, Bill Dubik, Harry Poland, Cecil Short, Len Meyer, Gene Johnson, Merle Kay, Red Carson, Don Phipps.
David Richardson, Leonard Haddock, Myron Tolbert, Don Paulson, Tom Harrison, Wally Felt, Marvin Stoley, Gil Sharp, Sonny Samuelson, Ed Chaplin, Pete Brown, Don Rouse, Marvin Bork, Glenn Lundahl, James Heights, Don Pulse, Clinton Carr, Gordon Eldren, Jerry Bullock, Weldon Carver, Dwayne Dahl, Clayton Cardell, Francis Pembroke, Harold Tell, Weldon Swarton, Douglas McQuiston, Don Chambers, Howard Grieve, Merle Swarton. Willis Call, Merle Ring, Norman Swanson, Junior Tarnell, Dean Solomon, Kenny Schrader, Darrell Judy, Earl Rose, Paul Hiskey, Walter Sonny Langdon, Weldon Jensen, Elton Miller, Eugene Erb, Carol Dallas, Bob Paul, Dick Pospichel, Willard Martels, Bud Simpson, Con Weston, Don Johnson, Frank Rosinski, Norval Udemar, Ralph Bierman, Ian Elmore, Steve Wilkerson, Paul Gustafson, Kenny Chambers, Leon Baker, Dean Green, Don Rossi, David Gross, Dennis Meyer, Morris Beckenall, Michael Hanks, Danny Lund, Gene Lawson, Wes Clark, Gary Schreeder, Pete Lundahl, Roger Hanson, Tom Turner, Pat Frederickson, Dean Leonard, Richard Bach, Gary Lund, Bob Anderson, John Addy, Larry Hitz, Butch Edward, Dale Weldon, Melvin Witt, Willie Nixon, Jeff Swanson, Harvey Anderson, Randy Blatter. Doug Lewis, Bob Swan, Alvy Nixon, Dick Long, Donald Culligan, Gerald Johnson, Bob Warehouser, Don Baker, Larry Lou, Martin Strickle, Jerry Ellis, Gerald Meyer, David Carlson, and Dwayne Anderson. Desert Storm, Persian Gulf, Scott Woods, Tori Nelson, Mike Hanson, and Dave Lawrence. Lost at sea and missing in action: Lieutenant Paul Hart, Lieutenant Alan Kegel,